This video is the first part of a comprehensive lore guide for the Dark Souls series. I will cover every relevant event in chronological order and solve its mysterious overarching narrative, uncovering both the microcosmic and the macrocosmic secrets, which are like mirrors to each other. As is above, so is below. But before I delve deep into the story of Dark Souls, I will explain my method of analysis to avoid confusion. Feel free to skip this section of the video through the timestamps I provide if you're not interested. Text is merely one of the various ways the game tells its story. It's not the most important one, even. Contextual clues, environmental storytelling through item and NPC placements, visual design, architectural design, Miyazaki's repeated writing patterns, narrative developments, symbolism and references to literature, esoteric knowledge, and religion are other such ways. It is important to note that item descriptions are written from an in-universe perspective, and they seldom pose questions of their own. In order to truly understand Dark Souls, we must take this into account. And lastly, I will demonstrate that a major mystery can be solved with a single paragraph of text as its backbone. I will use Demon Souls for this example to not disturb the video's timeline. The soul of the blind candle maiden can be transposed into the Soul Sucker spell, which is a spell that represents avarice, like the Ring of Avarice that absorbs additional souls from the beings you kill. The description of the spell says the Candle Maiden was once one of the oldest and most dangerous demons. And who else can use the Soul Sucker spell? King Gallant, the warrior king who awoke the Old One. Like the Sorcerer Queen, the Candle Maiden had done in times past. Mird was a vast empire located at the center of the world. It was so great as to contemplate most of human civilization. Through its discovery of the soul arts, mankind ushered in an age of unprecedented prosperity and enlightenment. The soul arts are a soft allegory to the knowledge granted to man by the fruit of knowledge of good and evil of the Book of Genesis. The duality of man is one of the main themes of Demon Souls. It's also not a coincidence that the Old One looks like a tree. Its design is a reference to the Tree of Knowledge. Massive spiraling towers were built to serve as schools dedicated to the study of the arts by royalty. They were a statement by men, an announcement that they'd reach the heavens through elucidation. A Tower of Babel, yet another reference to the Book of Genesis. This age of plenty would not last forever. The Queen, who was a prodigal sorcerer, along with her coven of witches, would abuse the powers of the soul. Their avarice would awaken the Old One, a primordial creature who gave agency to man's darkest thoughts, fears, and desires, birthing the demons. In future times, a new occult cabal would be formed by the descendants of that corrupt nobility, and one of its characters is called Mephistopheles, a reference to the tale of Faust, which is also a major hint. Mephistopheles is a demon who tempts Faust to trade his soul for knowledge and power. Where do you find the two copies of the Ring of Avarice whose effect is similar to the Soul Sucker spell? In Latria, and both belong to avaricious occultists like the Candle Maiden used to be. Miyazaki has a long history of writing symbolic punishments for his characters, which is why the Candle Maiden was blinded, a punishment that literally and figuratively stripped her of her enlightenment. She is simple-minded, as though she was lobotomized, in an ironic contrast to her old self. She is also made to tend to the flames, to keep the candles of the temple lit, a mockery of her former status as the most enlightened of all humans. There is another character that parallels the old witch queen, her direct descendant, the Queen of Latria. She too was punished for her sinful desire for esoteric knowledge, by having her brain literally removed from her head as she was turned into a doll. Additional clues that corroborate the claim that the Candle Maiden was the one who triggers the first scourge are the statues of the Nexus, one of which depicts a hooded figure, the Witch Queen, which stands below, and the other which depicts a warrior king, which stands above. The Candle Maiden frequently stands beside the statue that depicts her old self. A similarly subtle clue is present in Bloodborne to tell the story of one of its main characters, the doll. She frequently stands beside the grave that transports us to the dream where Maria, the person she was based on, resides. The Candle Maiden also wears all black, which denotes the gravity of her sin. The Monumentals used to be witches as well, but chose to repent on their own volition, and were thus symbolically punished by having their souls transposed into crippled wooden dolls, that are sentenced to meditate for eternity to mend the fabric of reality as a way of alleviating the damage caused by their sin. They wear all white, immaculate robes, a symbol of purity. They have childlike, emotionless faces, denoting innocence and erudition, and their heads are bald, symbolizing chastity. If I had restricted myself to reading item descriptions and the dialogue of the characters, and interpreting them literally, removing them from their respective contexts, such elaborate conclusions would be out of the question. The people who dogmatically adhere to text-based analysis, downplaying other forms of evidence, will never truly understand the layered games developed by From Software. I know there will be plenty of people who will denounce this video as headcanon or fanfiction, because I refuse to simply read item descriptions, quote dialogue uncritically, and only occasionally mention a random curiosity, like, did you know Radan loved his tiny horse, to decipher the story of Dark Souls like the contents they're used to watching. But I also know I will not be merely casting pearls before swine, as there is a great deal of intelligent and curious people among my audience and beyond it. With that said, may you be welcome to the complete lore guides to Dark Souls. As a final disclaimer, there will be several claims that may initially seem unusual, but rest assured, they will be thoroughly explained in later sections of the video or of the series, when it's more appropriate to do so. I have chosen to prioritize clarity, ensuring that the broader narrative can be grasped with greater simplicity and coherence. The world began devoid of life. It was a vast plain of grey crags, stone arch trees, and everlasting dragons, shrouded by fog. But then there was fire. During this age of ancients, there were no souls roaming the land, and thus the dragon statues existed as everlasting, devoid of life and death. They were not immortal, as the concepts of life and death themselves did not yet arrive. Fire came as the last of the pure, intrinsically natural elements. It brought duality to the world, altering it to the core. Its light became life. The embers that naturally traveled upward through the underworld and emerged from the arch trees imbued the dragon statues with souls. The inner workings of the world of Dark Souls are Aristotelian in nature. There are four main elements that can be represented as four sides of a diagram. Souls are a complex element of nature. They mean life, conscience, warmth, and are mostly composed of light, and as such are mostly opposites to dark. At the very bottom of the world, a few embers got caught within the earth, and from the shadow-engulfed soil were born the primordial ancestors of mankind. At this time, they were a meek and frail kin, much like those that will be called hollow in the future. Hungry for more light, yet vulnerable to the normal stretches of fire, they searched the caves for more stray embers hidden underground. The pygmies are akin to primitive humans. As they bear small quantities of light within them, they are closer to animals than to proper men. They predominantly operate under the guidance of their instincts. The first among them to find a substantial shard of flame buried in the ground was later remembered as the Furtive Pigmy. That pygmy brought the newfound shards to his kin and shared it with them. And from that interaction, they entered a new stage of evolution. They absorbed the chunks of fire, which contained an abundance of light, becoming humans. This is a fantastical depiction of real-world anthropology. The ancestors of man learned to control fire and were fundamentally impacted by that discovery. Instances of Dark Souls referencing real-world historical events, but with a fantastical twist, are very frequent. All humanoids that are not artificial creations descend from the pygmies. The Furtive Pigmy, as stated by Miyazaki, is humanity's primal ancestor. The family of the Furtive Pigmy quickly expanded itself, and its branches spread far and wide. It was during this period that clans, hierarchies, and culture arose, and with all that, the race for more Lord Souls, for more power. Through the powers of the soul, which again represents enlightenment and consciousness, man conquers the elements around them, bending them to their will by channeling them with their energy. Souls are located within one's heart and flow upward through one's blood, nurturing one's brain, which is why the eyes serve as windows to the soul. This is also why the minds of men have the capacity to create spells. Creativity is a powerful energetic force. 3 more great souls are found by beings who would later be known as Lords. Nito, first of the dead. The Witch of the East. And Gwyn. It is now important to note that the opening presents the events it depicts, out of order. The Pigmy was the first to find a great soul, but it was the last to be shown by the cinematic. The reason for that is that the cinematic is written as a tale that is being told in universe by an old woman. Its visuals can be unequivocally relied upon, but the way they are presented is deliberately deceiving. The humans, not as meek as they once were, wanted more. They desired to reach for the heavens, to escape their confinement in the depths of the world. And that was the main purpose of the greatest of all wars, the war against the dragons. The dragons are the most primordial beings of this world. They precede life itself, and they esoterically represent the raw energy of nature, the prima materia. Which is why upon attaining gnosis, man wanted to conquer nature itself. They wanted to rule over the earthly world. The dragons were the apex species of the surface, and so, in order to inherit the earth, the meek had to lead them to extinction. The opening cinematic of the first game informs us of the main events that took place during this transitional step for mankind. However, the tale that is narrated to us by an unknown elderly woman is heavily propagandized. It omits, mystifies, and desynchronizes history. As this video will clearly and concisely demonstrate, identifying and deciphering propaganda is key to understanding the story of Dark Souls. The first and most blatant form of propaganda comes with terminology. Gods do not exist in the world of Dark Souls. At least not in the way as is understood by most. All humans share the same biological origin. Gwyn and every other so-called god are descendant of the same kin. All descended from the hollow creatures that came from the dark. All have the Pigmy as their common ancestor. That is not to say that there aren't many humanoid beings of extraordinary power who come in many shapes. Some that can be said to belong to different species, even, that have reached a grander evolutionary step through their wealthier souls, but that those gods are not inherently special. The war was fought by the united forces of mankind. Gwyn, the leader of a clan of warriors, married one of the Eastern witches to cement a political alliance between their families. The forces of Gwyn, the witches, Nito, and the ancient clan of the Pygmy Lords fought as one, and it was for that reason that they succeeded in an impossible feat against the direst of foes. Yet just combining their strength was not enough to defeat their enemy. They had to plan an elaborate strategy if they were to have a chance. As an aside, both Demon Souls and Dark Souls feature a marriage between a queen that represents the esoteric feminine, a conspiratorial witch, and a king who represents the esoteric masculine, a warrior. And in Elden Ring's case, there are 2 such marriages. Just like the previous section of the cinematic, the war is presented to us out of chronological order, as to serve an in-universe agenda that props Gwyn as the protagonist of the ordeal. The time of day changes from scene to scene, and from this subtle detail, we can infer the genuine sequence of events. First, Nito unleashed his miasma of death and disease to weaken the dragons and their arch-trees, which served as their nests. The sky bears the same visual it had during the Age of Ancients, because this event was the first step of man's plan of conquest. Then, the witches burned the arch-trees and the dragons with their firestorm. During this scene, the sky is purple, as fire had invaded the world's surface. That mass fire likely accelerates the process of the night turning into day. The scene where Sif, the Scaleless, mourns upon a pile of bodies of his dead kin, takes place during the witches' assault. As he recognized they were about to face defeat, he switched sides and betrayed the dragons by revealing their secrets to man. He instructed men about the alchemical formula behind the dragon's composition. The ancient dragons possessed lunar powers, not unlike what later became known as sorcery. Their abilities were slowly distorted by the elements that encircles them and their descendants, but originally, they conjured water and light, crystalline magic to fight against humanity. The sorcery named White Dragon Breath states that it is an appropriation of the power of the ancient dragons. It was only after Sif's betrayal that mankind emerged to the surface to fight on land, as Gwyn implies the perfect alchemical formula to counter their stone scales. The recipe that produced Gwyn's bolts of lightning, which are a blend of light and fire. Lightning stands as the opposite to the stone scales of the dragons, which are composed of water and dark. They also forged weapons that could pierce the dragon's scales, exploiting yet another vulnerability they had. We can see the corpses of the dragons that had perished from the witch's assault as Gwyn conjures his lightning bolts to hail at the survivors. Armies of humans engaged in direct conflict with the weakened and distressed ancient dragons, whose secrets had been revealed, but even then, it took a score of their own to slay a single enemy combatant. Giants, golem-like beings sculpted by Izalith from the remains of dragons, humans, and archtrees, were deployed against the dragons and fought as slave soldiers. As Gwyn, whose name derives from the Welsh word for white, and can also mean holy, led the climactic battle that decisively placed mankind as a dominant species, he was hailed as a divine figure, a mighty warrior king who symbolically brought the dawn upon the world. For this, he earned the deific title of Lord of Light, and became the supreme ruler of man. The war lasted for centuries, and both sides were irrevocably shaped by it. In the case of the dragons, biologically reshaped. The stone ancient dragons, the everlasting dragon statues of yore that were animated by sparks of fire, had gone mostly extinct. Each of their corpses that fell to the ground served as a bed of new life. Their remains spawned rivers, plants, and animals. The deep location where most of those corpses fell into became known as the Great Swamp, a harsh region that brims with nature. Its water became poisonous, however, for the corpses of felled warriors contaminated it with their blood. The remains of the dragons also birthed wyverns and other dragon-like life forms. Most notably, the primordial serpents rose from the remains of their dead ancestors. Primordial serpents are often depicted in artifacts of the Great Swamp. The world was going through a period of transformation, increasing in its complexity. When the tides of war seemed to have calmed down, the empires of humanity expanded their domain and influence. The world was at its dawn. The era that ensued was marked by expansive crusades against the descendants of the dragons. Humanity had the intention of driving them to extinction, and so the war was vastly prolonged. Gwyn built his kingdom on top of the tallest arch tree, a location emblematic of his ambitious and proudful nature. He constructed enormous walls that served to seclude his allegorical paradise from the rest of the world. He also orders the construction of a great library, the Grand Archives. There, Sif, who had earned dukedom, was desperately attempts to recreate the everlasting dragons and reproduce their immortality. The Vinheim School of Sorcery was founded, and would operate within Sif's Grand Archives. Its alumni studied alongside Sif, who'd become known as the grandfather of sorcery. The ancient dragons, the subjects of their studies, conjured powers akin to sorcery itself, which is why the artifacts produced by Vinheim depicts them, and why the institution earned its name, the Dragon School. Gwyn's clan had, ironically enough, both envied and admired the dragons for generations. They referenced their forms in their imagery. For example, Gwyn's armor bears a grotesque-looking face that seems to depict a fusion between a man and a dragon. His knights adorn their helmets with horns inspired by those of the dragons, which they considered to be a symbol of wisdom. Gwyn's quest for an immortal empire is based on the erroneous notion that the dragons themselves, the prima materia, had once attained that during the Age of Ancients. But that notion is misguided, for nature is always cyclical. His quest is like that of the alchemist who seeks the unfeasible philosopher's stone, though, again, in a case of dramatic irony, the alchemical magnum opus would overthrow him in a distant future. A coalition of 4 rulers from Velka's bloodline, each representing a cardinal direction, founded Astora, the vastest of all countries that encompassed the territory from the walls that secluded Gwyn's kingdom, which became known as the World of Man, all the way to Izalith's entrance. In a calculated gesture of benevolence, Gwyn bequeathed to them a chunk of his lord's soul, gifted them the title of kings, and marriages were proposed to merge their bloodlines even further. They built a city to serve as the capital of Astora, and named it New Londo in homage to the so-called City of the Gods. The capital would feature various statues that depicted Velka as a motherly figure. The royal lineage of Astora would be a branch of the bloodline of the gods, despite its members living outside the world of man. Gwyn commissioned Sif, the alchemist, to produce a mechanism that would prolong the age of fire, that is, the time of day, so that his earthly empire would last for eternity. The curse serves as a part of a soft Gnostic allegory, with Gwyn, who would be deified by propaganda, representing the demiurge, and his curse being the soul extraction mechanism. Gwyn is an archetypal antichrist. His deific title, Lord of Light, references Lucifer, whose name means Lightbringer. The dark sign also represents the mark of the beast. Those marked by Gwyn's seal employ souls as currency, unlike proper men, who use coins. For this purpose, Sif ordered the construction of a fortress, under the alias of Sen, that he'd use to abduct undead to conduct experiments on. The stated goal of the fortress was to recruit capable warriors to serve as Gwyn's knights. This excuse goes in line with the admiration Gwyn's clan of warriors had for valor and might since ancient times. The name of the fortress has a double meaning. Sen is both Sif's alias and a pun. In the Japanese version, Sen is written phonetically, which could be read as 1,000, perhaps indicating that the fortress houses 1,000 traps or guards, but could also be the name of a character. As I will demonstrate, Miyazaki frequently creates pseudonyms and alternate personas for his characters, for reasons important to the narrative. In this case, Sif wanted to hide his identity to avoid suspicion. Sif would extensively study specific life forms, such as the basilisks, creatures that descend from the dragons, and that spew a mist that can sip the life of those who enter its range. The basilisks themselves developed this mechanism through evolution. They are incomplete dragons, who, like other related species, aim to become grander like their predecessors. Sif would finally have an epiphany. He would produce contaminated sparks of flame, which would naturally be absorbed by all that is living, with a curse that links their soul to the sun. This link would make it so their energy is gradually drained to fuel the sun, extending its run as the ruling celestial body. The dark would be shackled within the underworld and not be allowed to exert its natural course. The dragons, who after their defeat, were either reduced to simpler life forms or outright forced to crawl on their bellies, who were confined to the underworld as men had been during the Age of Ancients, the age ruled by the dragons, would, as the natural cycle progressed, regain their power. Gwyn's curse would serve to shackle them as well, so that they would never be a threat to his empire. The curse spreads mainly through death. As one dies, his soul would normally leave his body and be absorbed by what surrounds it. In the case of those afflicted with the curse, a portion of it also goes to fuel the sun. Sif also created an artificial method of immortality for himself. He would extensively ferment a special crystal and link it to his soul, which would be nurtured by it continually. Crystals are, in essence, formed by fermented souls. By sucking the souls out of undead, he managed to become virtually immortal, though his immortality was linked to that crystal, and so if it ever broke, he would regain his mortality. The Curse of Undead would alter the logic of the world. Time and space would be twisted by it. Light and dark are intrinsically linked to the concept of time, and the concept of space follows its course. Gradually, each region would be confined to its own layer of space-time, and the lands began to drift, converging towards the sun. Before proceeding with the timeline, I will briefly explain Astora's significance and how I reached my conclusions about it. The placement of items and NPCs within areas are major clues as to the story of the game. We find various items and NPCs directly associated with Astora, such as the Crest Shield, the Dragon Crest Shield, the Sword of Astora, the Ring of the Evil Eye, 2 embers that are handled by the Blacksmith of Astora, that is, Andre, within the stretch that covers from Firelink Shrine to the Darkroot Garden, the Valley of Drakes, the Undead Parish, the Catacombs, the Tomb of the Giants, and the Depths. All those places are within Astora's domain. Gwyn had founded the religion, the Way of White, to further cement his royal lineage's deific status, a reference to the divine right of kings of real-world history. The main function of the Way of White, however, would be to spread the Curse of Undead. The Way of White produced the first Undead, Paladin Leroy, and instructed him to leave the upper walls of the world of man, which were built with the specific purpose of preventing contaminated undead from entering Gwyn's domain, accompanied by a maiden to spread the curse. This maiden was Anastasia, the same person we see producing an undead in the opening cinematic by infecting a corpse at a graveyard near the place that would later be known as Firelink Shrine with an accursed spark of flame, and whose name means resurrection. The maiden inserts the sparks into his eye socket, and the dark sign is displayed on the screen, as the narrator is speaking of the fading of the day. Leroy entered Nito's domain, his catacombs, and told Nito of Gwyn's conspiracy. He offered him a deal that would be beneficial to both parties. By collaborating with the Way of White, Nito would spread his death, which would, in turn, spread the curse alongside it. And in the future, after he was done fulfilling his duty, he became Nito's personal bodyguard, invading those who come near his tomb. From this point on, whenever an agent of the Way of White needed to commune with Nito to become one of his Gravelord paladins, they'd access his lair through a secret passageway, the same one the player can use to enter Nito's cave, to make a pact with him. Due to this development, Nito became known as Allfather Lloyd, an ironic title, as Nito aims to become the Allfather of the dead. His motivation is dualistic in nature. He wants to create a big family for himself, but for that, he must proliferate death. Nito's name is both a diminutive of Benito, meaning blessed, as well as the Japanese word for rabbit, which might be a reference to his ironic Allfather title, as rabbits are, traditionally, symbols of procreation and fertility. The one truth about Allfather Lloyd is that he was, indeed, Gwyn's uncle. His catacombs were constructed to provide respite for his family, that is, for the dead. There are various traps and contraptions that prevent invaders from looting and disturbing its inhabitants. And Nito himself is the host of a family of skeletons that cling on to him, like they are his overly attached children. We also find literal children near his hiding place, further expanding on the theme of family. Pinwheel, a necromancer, is also deeply tied to these ideas. He is a family of 3 people joined into one being, who wears 3 masks, one that represents the father, one that represents the mother, and one that represents the child. He seeks to improve his necromantic arts to fully revive the deceased, which is why he is in possession of the Rite of Kindling, which he stole from Nito. This is why Paladin Leroy aids the player in killing Pinwheel. The entirety of Nito's domain is filled with artifacts that are associated with the Way of White. Besides the obvious connection between Nito, who is the Allfather Lloyd, and his paladins, there is a more relevant reason for that. The agents of the Way of White, especially those of lower rank, are sent to the catacombs in borderline suicidal missions. This is what we see happen to Rhea and her companions. They were instructed by higher-ups to journey to the underworld and find the Rite of Kindling, a rite that would supposedly heal the undead curse, due to its kindling properties. But their quest was secretly designed to retrieve the Rite of Kindling from Pinwheel, and the rite itself is not in any way a cure to the plague. Ironically, the Way of White's stated goal is to heal the curse and eliminate those afflicted with it. It is a complete and utter sham, and its high-ranking clerics are specifically selected for their faithlessness. The Torland talismans, which are gifted to said high-ranking clerics, do not scale with faith at all. Patches, the most infamous of liars who happens to be found in Nito's catacombs, further reinforcing a subtle, symbolic way, the deceitful plot unfolding there is infuriated by clerics, for even a conman like him can stand the level of falsehood they operate under. In yet another Fox show of generosity, Gwyn gifted the ancient clan of the Pygmies an isolated paradise, the Ringed City, whose name itself is a representation of Gwyn's plot. One of Gwyn's own offspring, Filianor, would be placed in charge of the Great Soul that belongs to the Pygmies lineage for generations. The soul that is, in universe, what is called the Dark Soul. The half-consumed Great Soul of the Pygmies is so old that it solidified into an egg-like crystal, Similarly to how a left-behind humanity that is allowed to stagnate turns into a vagrant. As soon as the pygmies and the men they led migrated to the Ringed City, however, Gwyn taps them on the back with the curse, casting the dark sign upon them. In response to Gwyn's curse, Izalith devised a plan to further its power and influence. Its matriarchal leader, the witch, would employ their great soul to birth a new form of life. She constructed a colossal emerald dome, emerald being a material prone to storing fire, as exemplified by the Estus flask and Shanalot's epitaph, the Emerald Herald, around her civilization, the soil of which was densely packed with corpses of dragons, men, and organic remains of destroyed archtrees, rested within their central archtree, and self-immolated herself with the power of the Great Soul. This ritual was a reenactment of how life first arose in the world, with the first flame appearing within an archtree and imbuing matter with souls. The ritual resulted in the creation of the Bed of Chaos. Izalith suffered an immense transformation. Its water became red and hot, its roots became burnt, and its inhabitants became deformed by fusing with all manner of organic material. It was a calculated tragedy of epic proportions that succeeded in its purpose. The creation of the Chaos Flame was a product of an ever-escalating Cold War between two empires. From its power, a new culture arose, the birth of the chaotic beings, the demons. It is worth noting that demon is, primarily, a derogatory propagandistic term that refers to the inhuman creatures of Izalith, who antagonized Gwyn's empire. The demons had a royal lineage, Vemos being one of its descendants, and even developed a language of their own. There are two types of creatures that are known as, or can be said to be, demons. Beings that were reshaped and deformed as a result of the eruption of the chaos of Izalith, such as the Ceaseless Discharge and Quileg, and the animated demon statues, beings sculpted from organic remains that are chimeric in nature. They were created to serve as inhumanly strong military assets for Izalith. Examples include the Stray Demons, the Taurus Demons, the Capra Demons, the Batwing Demons, and the Gargoyles. Demonic beings that appeared later, such as the Grus and the Swamp Bears, were organically born out of the remains within Izalith. In fact, some Grus worship the statues as though they were their deific ancestors. There are other beings, however, which were born from the chaos of Izalith, but seem to not necessarily be considered demons, such as the reanimated corpses of dragons, like the ones colloquially known as Dragonbutts and the Undead Dragons. As a brief aside, the Sanctuary Guardian, who is said to be close to the beings known as demons for its chimeric nature, preceded the Chaos Flame. He was born from very specific circumstances. His arena was a battleground where an ancient dragon fell. The remains of that dragon fused with those of the man it had killed and gave birth to the Guardian. His design is yet another microcosmic key to the puzzle that is the narrative of Dark Souls. His upper half is a white lion, representing the dawn, as well as Gwyn himself, whose name means white and whose clan is represented by the image of a lion. He was born from the remains of dragons that were felled by the man who conquers the world's surface. Gwyn, the Lord of Light, symbolically brought the dawn upon the world as he defeated the dragons. The Guardian has 4 wings, a tail, and 2 horns, paralleling the ancient dragons. His demonic-looking horns, as well as his Baphomet-looking lower half, which ends in a poisonous scorpion's tail, denotes the treacherous nature of Gwyn's dawn. He backstabs mankind to whatever extends the time of day, shackling the dark, similarly to how the Sanctuary Guardian gatekeeps Oolacile from the undead who seeks to defeat the dark of the abyss. Despite the underlying animosity, Izalith maintains a superficially amicable relation with the world of man. Izalith traded giants, who would serve the world of man as slave workers and sentinels, and Batwing demons in return for Titanite slabs, which are said to be the domain of the gods, implying an Orlando held a quasi-monopoly over them. Titanite are simply the soul-imbued remains of living beings, hailing from the portion of the body that contains one's core. Which is why Titanite slabs are so precious. They are the largest of Titanite variants, for they come from extraordinary beings. One uniquely relevant giant who Izalith had sold to an Orlando became known as the nameless Blacksmith deity, for he forged the weapons of the gods, and resided at their premises. He is the giant blacksmith we find in Orlando. The technique he employs to create special weapons from memories was an invention of Sif, who he refers to as the Duke and appears to have a close bond with. This technique will be elaborated upon later. The place that would, in the future, be extensively reformed and become known as the Depths was, at this point in time, a trade route that connected Izalith, Astora, and the world of men, similar to our world's Silk Road. Through it, titanite, weapons, and other commodities were transported in wagons, and merchants sat alongside its path to sell their goods to the various travelers. Sometime during this epoch, the first Abyssal Rebellion against Gwyn's rule took place. The Curse of Undead was proving to be a major issue to the people who lived outside the upper walls of the world of men. They had begun to assume fleeting forms, that is, as their souls were drained, they regressed into the primitive forms of men's primal ancestors. The governance of the 4 diligent kings proved to be adaptable at first, and they kept the undead under control, but eventually the blight overwhelmed them. To combat the curse, the 4 kings, influenced by Kav, a primordial serpent, who represents the serpent of the Book of Genesis, develops the art of life drain. The kings and their knights went on a rampage of soul extraction, emulating in the microcosm what Gwyn himself was doing to mankind. Kav told the 4 of them they were destined to be his Dark Lord, that they had the duty to empower the humans and free them from the shackles of the gods, that is, from the Curse of Undead, from Gwyn's seal, and consequently to call upon the Age of Dark, where mankind would strive. To prevent the abyss from spreading, Velka ordered her agents, the crimson-robed healers who wear crow masks, to seal New Londo, and a great flood ruined the already broken city. The 4 kings were imprisoned within a deep layer of darkness. The massacre generated a strong current of negative energy, which manifested as physical objects with magical properties, the Red Eye Orbs. Kav had intended to harm Gwyn's empire by inciting the 4 kings to rebel against it, but the insurgence was successfully contained, and his plan ended up backfiring in the long term. Gwyn founded an international order of knights. He selected 4 competent fighters and gifted each of them a unique ring and a small chunk of his lord's soul. Artorias, a knight from Astora, more specifically from Oolacile. Azure blue is the color of the Knights of Astora, a symbol of their pride and glory. It is seen on both the elite knight armor set, which is even worn by a prince, and on Artorias' cape. The crest that adorns his cape is also similar to the patterns featured in gear that hails from Astora. His crest is the key to the gates that leads to the interior of the Darkroot Garden, which used to be known in times of old as the Royal Garden. Wolves are a symbol of loyalty. His companion wolf Sif has a name that derives from Old English and means affinity or connection, and Artorias was said to have an unbendable will of steel. He was trained as a warrior from countless battles of stoicism. He became known as a hero by hunting and defeating the Darkwraiths with his divine sword. This is why he was appointed by Gwyn to serve as one of his knights. Kieran is an assassin with ties to Izalith, for she stems more closely from the lineage of the witches. Her name, Kieran, sounds like a westernized version of a conventionally oriental name in the context of Dark Souls. She wears a tunic that resembles the gold-hemmed set worn by the Daughters of Chaos, though its color is the azure blue of the noble house of Astora. Her mask has ivory locks, like the hair of the witches, as well as demonic horns on its sides. She wields weapons symbolic of the East and of Izalith. One of her blades inflicts a vicious poison, a reference to the hazardous waters of her lineage's homeland, and she is said to brandish her gold tracer in a mesmerizing dance. Dancers are frequently associated with Oriental lands as well as with the feminine in Miyazaki's works. Kieran also represents the esoteric feminine, like Izalith as a whole. Her cyclopic third eye is a symbol of occult knowledge, and she acts in the shadows as an assassin. Her name means Little Dark One, which is ironic considering her disdain toward humans, which she, as a member of royalty, perceives as lesser creatures. Guff, a slave giant sculpted in Izalith and traded to Oolacile to serve as a sentinel. He is locked away in a tower, the spot from where he watches for threats to his town, and is an obsessive sculptor, a subtle reference to Izalith, the land of sculptors. In fact, Izalith may mean land of stonemakers, Firelink is Greek for stone, and Ize is a suffix that means to make. The artifacts he carves are also subtly similar to giants, and to demons, for they are carved out of petrified remains of arch trees and imbued with a tiny portion of his soul. He imparts each carving with an emotion, which helps him achieve personal enlightenment. He faced discrimination for his nature as a giant by the inhabitants of Oolacile, and they covered his helmet with wax, possibly during his sleep, disabling his famously sharp eyesight. Like all giants, Goth is pure and simple of mind, and so has never managed to realize that, thinking he had suddenly gone blind. Despite his lack of sight, he still proves to be a supernaturally capable archer, as he lands a shot at Calamite, aiming with his intuition alone. And Ornstein, the Lion Knight, the most prolific of dragon slayers. He served as a captain of the order, for he was the closest to Gwyn himself, having worked under Gwyn's firstborn, Faram. Smough, the royal executioner of Anorlondo, who hails from the house of Karim, desires to be noticed by Gwyn, and recruited into his order of knights. He cannibalized his victims in an attempt to attain ample strength, and thus assumed an inhuman shape. He bloated like a pig, nearly softening into sludge. He developed a taste for human flesh, and a sadistic appreciation for his line of work, the more he performed it. His nature is akin to that of a primordial serpent, and his sins were of greed and gluttony. He was once a meek human who felt incomplete, and so ate compulsively in a desperate attempt to become whole. Funnily enough, Frampt resents him, for he can see projected in him his own faults. In yet another case of dramatic irony, Smough proved himself more loyal than 3 of the 4 knights. He chose to guard the forsaken cathedral of Anorlondo, even after the gods had fled it. Sif was disillusioned by the disappointing fruits of his incessant research. He learns 2 terrible truths: that there is no easy solution for his plight, and that his betrayal was for naught. Sif is directly inspired by Faust, an alchemist whose frustration with his condition led him to make a deal with the devil, to sell his soul for knowledge, magical powers, and earthly pleasures. In earlier versions of this classic Germanic tale, Faust is irrevocably corrupted, and the devil carries him to hell. However, in Goethe's magnum opus, his own rendition of the story, Faust's soul is redeemed for his strivings, and because the symbolic feminine, embodied by Gretchen, pleads for his redemption. Sif later achieves redemption by striving to mend his mistake, and then sacrificing himself when the Chosen Undead comes to confront him. The deal made with Velka, the symbolic feminine, redeemed him. His fight, as well as the adventure through Sen's fortress, serve as a test of might to the undead who follow the prophecy. He forces the Chosen Undead to undergo a literal and symbolic death, which is the only mandatory death of the game, in a reference to the hero's journey. A depressed Sif was approached by Velka with a proposal, which was, in a way, an inversion of the proposal Gwyn had made to him in the Age of Ancients. He would direct his research to the production of a being capable of mending the fabric of reality, a perfect being who would bring salvation for both mankind and the dragons. For that, Velka would bequeath him a part of her own soul, which would be fused with Gwyn's along with the essence of the dragons to produce an alchemical masterpiece, the alchemical rebis, Gwyndolin. Velka's proposal to Sif was part of the greatest of all ploys. It was part of the Firelink conspiracy. Sif would begin his quest by capturing maidens and trying to inject into them the essence of the dragons. These would produce the tentacle maidens, the pitiful beings who haunt his prison complex. His bizarre experiments would make people perceive him as having gone mad, but he was perfectly lucid until his end. His capture of maidens and high-ranking members of the Way of White, as indicated by the white seance ring we find in his prison, was also a way to punish them for their sin of creating undead. Sif would produce 2 beings who were almost successful at being the rebis, Priscilla and Yorshka, but ultimately, it was Gwyndolin who proved to be the perfect union of masculine and feminine that was empowered by the dragons. He was an androgynous man whose femininity was so prominent he would be raised as a daughter, and whose lower half was composed of snakes, which are incomplete dragons. Both Priscilla and Yorshka would be hidden away and raised in secret, for their aberrational nature was too apparent and so would raise suspicion. The illusory magic Priscilla is so proficient in is a result of her disproportionate femininity. The feminine is esoterically associated with the occult. The dragons are associated with moonlight. After all, they hail from the Age of Ancients, which was a period of night. The masculine half of this feminine attribute in the context of Dark Souls is sorcery, which is, essentially, water magic. Gwyndolin would be presented as Gwyn's lastborn, as a legitimate offspring of him and Velka. He was integrated into royalty and would later be appointed to preside over Oolacile, a city outside the world of men where a branch of Astora's royal blood would reside. There, he studies the arts and developed a special type of magic, which not even Vinheim was able to. Spells that bent reality through light manipulation. That would be one of the first steps of his journey to become the god of illusion. In Oolacile, we see the legacy of the dualistic nature of the royal bloodline of the gods. There are various golems, whose production derives from the customs of Izalith, just like the elevators that operate via magic instead of being physical contraptions. However, Oolacile also displays a culture influenced by Gwyn's clan of warriors, with Gwyn himself being a warrior king. Its inhabitants conduct battles of stoicism in a huge arena that is located at the center of their territory. Champions of the Colosseum earned the right to join the ranks of Gwyn's Silver Knights. Oolacile eventually began to fall prey to the curse. The nobility would conduct searches with the aim of abducting those they suspect were contaminated. The suspects in question would be imprisoned near an ancient cave and tortured to the brink of death for information on others who they suspect to be undead. It was under such dire circumstances that Kaf appears to them. He tells them of Gwyn's conspiracy against mankind. Kaf's words fomented in them a rebellious spirit. The tortured man destroys the wall of their prison, and the whole directs them to an ancient graveyard where the tomb of the most primeval of men was located. The one known by history as the Furtive Pigmy, humanity's ancestor. They profaned it in the hopes of calling upon the Dark Lord, the Prince of Darkness that was promised by Kaf, who would overthrow Gwyn and call upon the Age of Darkness, that is, the Night. As his rest was disturbed, the Pygmy's humanity ran wild, and his unconsciousness took hold of him. He rose as a misshapen beast and brought ruin to Oolacile. His humanity was so powerful as to lead the sorcerers to the brink of madness, though it was through that communion with the Abyss that they learned the dark arts. The Pygmy, whose name was Manus, a reference to the ancestor of all men in Germanic myth, as well as to the Hindu Manu, who is also the progenitor of mankind, was now an embodiment of the Abyss, a hyperbolic personification of humanity. He acted on impulse and feeling and was driven by nostalgic, fading memories. He desperately searched for his pendant, a keepsake of his lover, her petrified heart. His desire to retrieve it was so strong that he can warp time and space to create a portal of darkness through which he can grab the undead who carries the pendants. This dim memory of his lover is also what motivated him to abduct Dusk, who is a distant descendant of his. He saw in her the image of his lover, and his warped perception, which was informed by his wild unconsciousness, led him to instinctually claim her. The Pygmy's pendant parallels the pendant we, the player, can choose as a starting gift. Though the item has no practical use in-game, it is, to the undead, who is always at the risk of hollowing, a process that means loss of self, loss of memory, a keepsake. It helps the undead keep his wits about him. As Gwyn learned of the incident, he sent one of his knights, Knight Artorias, who represents the pure ideals of chivalry and loyalty, to defeat the spawn of the Abyss and save the damsel in distress. The tale of Artorias subverts the archetypal story of the knight who rescues the princess from an evil dragon. His quest fails, and was doomed from the start, as Gwyn knew that even if Artorias succeeded, the victory against the Abyss would merely be temporary, and the allegorical dragon was the product of the king's own evil deeds. In fact, Artorias' very name is a reference to the Arthurian legends, and the name of the princess, Dusk, is a subtle hint at the subtext of the narrative of the Artorias of the Abyss DLC, and of the macrocosmic narrative of the series in general. As previously explained, darkness was artificially imprisoned at the bottom of the world, shackled by the curse. It resisted its unnatural confinement by attempting to spread itself and consume all it could reach. Gwyn's actions did not relinquish the dark, quite the contrary. By halting the natural cycle of light and dark, they corrupted it and caused it to go wild. The abominations that spawned from the want of the abyss were, in a way, Gwyn's creations. No matter how he tried to end them, they'd never appease their desire, since what they craved was out of their reach. The same would be the case if it were the other way around, as demonstrated by Dark Souls 3. And thus, the Arturian knight was tainted by his corrupt quest. His final fight was akin to a battle of stoicism that symbolically took place at the very arena of his hometown, and that may have been the first one he lost. His legacy would be celebrated by history, and both his lover, Quiran, and the warriors who admired him created gravesites to honor his memory. His companion wolf, Sif, would permanently protect his gravesite on Darkroot Garden, serving as both a guard and, incidentally, a judge who tests the might of those who seek to inherit Artorias' role as the Abyss Walker. Manus was ultimately defeated by a random, unnamed undead who hails from the future. This undead would be forgotten by history, just like the Furtive Pigmy himself. Eventually, Gwyn declared war against the demons of Izalith. He deployed his Silver Knights, who brandished unusually large weapons to face their inhuman foes. The Silver Knights would have their armors charred by the Chaos Flame, turning them black. This initial battle was but a skirmish in the long term. The war lasted for centuries. The war would prompt Gwyn to banish pyromancy, claiming it to be heretical. This would impress poorly on the nobles of Karim, as their house had ancestral ties to Izalith, and some of them were practitioners of the art. The vast silk road that connected the lands was reformed and sealed. Its bridges were demolished, and iron bars disabled the entrances and exits of its labyrinthic tunnels. Despite the raging war, both sides would be forced to begrudgingly cooperate to fight against an enemy greater in influence than even them both, to fight against a prophecy. The curse was gradually consuming the whole of the earth. Baldur, a land within Astora that, like Oolacile, was populated by nobles and employed coins as currency, was among the first to suffer from an outbreak of undead. Its ruler, Rendel, whose name means wolf and shield, bears the title of Night King, denoting a culture of warriors. The curse is spread mainly through death, and so, those who engage in battle are easily infected, for if an undead dies in their proximity, they absorb accursed sparks of his soul. The culture of Baldur was directly inspired by Gwyn's clan, which is why its rulers are warrior kings, and its royal lineage may directly descend from Gwyn's. The curse eventually managed to penetrate the walls of the world of men. The allegorical paradise was now tainted by its mark. Nobles who become afflicted with the curse and resort to taking the souls of others are punished for their greed. They are turned into mimics, monsters who symbolize greed, and who conversely punish the greedy, for they devour those who attempt to steal the treasures they conceal. Velka, the goddess of sin and punishment, whose name derives from the Finnish word for debt, exposed Gwyn's actions and denounced them as sinful. Gwyn's firstborn, Faram, could not stand to hunt the dragons to extinction, and Velka's allegations were the final nails to the coffin. He fled alongside Ornstein, his closest friend and disciple, on a pilgrimage to a distant land. As is above, so is below. A conflict between the main noble houses of the two largest cities of the world of men was triggered by the dispute between Gwyn and Velka. The house of Karim stood on Velka's side, while the house of Torland supported Gwyn. This political struggle earned Velka her infamous reputation as a rogue goddess, and prompted an inquisition, that is, a witch hunt, against the dissenters. The suspected conspirators were publicly tortured and executed. In the shadows, Velka would commune with the primordial serpents, who became her closest allies. Their objectives harmoniously converge. This too is an esoteric reference to Gnostic readings of the Bible. Velka represents Eve, or perhaps Lilith, who communed with the serpents to betray Adam, her proudful husband. Velka would promise them they'd finally be whole again, and that Gwyndolin, the one who'd replace Gwyn as the king of the gods, would enact his rule with their welfare in mind. The serpents would act as guides for the Chosen Undead, instructing them to follow Velka's plan. Calf, whose name might be a reference to the golden calf of the Old Testament, and Frampt, whose name means primordial sock puppet, pose as opposites, but serve the same goal. Both tell half-truths to the undead. This false duality is depicted in symbolism related to Velka, such as the images adorning the gates of the churches her descendants would build in the distant future. The conspiracy aims to hold undead of all possible backgrounds within its grasp, to make each of them into an asset. Velka would ritualistically sacrifice herself for the sake of her conspiracy, which aims to restore the natural state of the world, undoing the curse of undead in the process. Her soul would be divided in various chunks, the greater of which was used to fuel a flame in the very depths of the world. Other pieces of her being would be employed to create artifacts that would aid the undead who would follow her prophecy, such as the Rings of Sacrifice and the Tearstone Rings. Before her death, however, Velka would write a prophecy, which would serve to motivate undead of various lands to undergo a hero's journey that would grant them ample strength and punish four great sinners. Nito, the Plague Spreader, the Witch of Chaos, who responded to the first sin with a great sin of her own, Sif, the alchemist who betrayed his kin, and the Four Kings, the rulers who fell to temptation. The great souls those four beings held would be offered to a Lord Vessel, a fire-linking artifact that, upon its activation, opens a portal to a layer of retracted time, where the major fire-linking bonfire resides. The Lord Vessel would also recycle those four great souls. The ritualistic journey of the Chosen Undead would culminate in an act of martyrdom, as the undead would sacrifice himself to link the fire, using his own soul that was nourished by his adventure, as well as the soul of the sun itself, to fuel the flame of the underworld. Half of his soul would be reincarnated, and half of it would feed the bonfire. The mechanism behind fire linking ingeniously utilizes the dark sign, a hole that links men's souls to the sun, to extract energy from it. This process would culminate in an eclipse, as the sun would, in the distant future, have its soul drained by ages of fire linking. It would acquire an appearance identical to the dark sign itself, which is a visual representation of the emptiness within a hollow's chest. Gwyndolин's name means white ring. It is a reference to the final stage of the eclipse, which is the combination of the sun, which represents the masculine, and was emboldened by Gwyn, who stands for the day, and the moon, which represents the feminine, and was emboldened by Velka, who stands for the night. Even if the Chosen Undead desired to reject martyrdom and rule with his newfound strength as a Dark Lord, he would still serve as an asset for the Firelink conspiracy. He still has to fuel the Lord Vessel with four great souls, and the Serpents, who are allies of Velka and Gwyndolin, would act as his advisors. Velka's plan was nearly foolproof. As an aside, it's interesting to note that the Undead is deceived to believe that by linking the fire, he is following Gwyn's will, when in truth, he is following Velka's, and by becoming the Dark Lord, he emulates Gwyn's ambition of ruling the world as an Antichrist figure. Velka's final act before her death was the creation of the Painted World, a place that served not only to hide the traces of her conspiracy, but also to house her helpers who fell martyred by it and had nowhere to call home. Among Velka's most relevant traits is her nurturing character. She took pity on her ruined collaborators, and so painted the worlds they could call home under the pseudonym Ariamis. This pseudonym is based on the Greek word eremaias, as informed by the Japanese script, which means desert, solitude, or an inhabited region, which is quite fitting considering the painting looks akin to a white desert of snow, whose inhabitants are the forlorn. The name of the painting is, then, the Painted World of Solitude. The Painted World is, essentially, a chunk of Karim that was removed from the rest of the world. We can see the vestiges of the brutal witch hunts that took place in Karim. Among the denizens of the painting, there are various users of pyromancy. Practicing the forbidden art alone was enough reason to be taken down by the witch hunters. Multiple forbidden artifacts were hidden inside it, such as pyromancy scrolls and the dark ember. The center point of the painting is a statue of Velka herself, depicted as a caring mother, which also doubles as an occult mechanism that opens the main gates of Ariamis. This is a subtextual clue as to the nature of both Velka, Priscilla, and the Painted World. The Painting Guardians are all undead whose attire denotes their affiliation with Velka. They bear Velka's rune on their clothes, and their faces are covered as both a reference to the esoteric nature of their master, as well as for the practical purpose of hiding their hollowing. Like I've mentioned before, dancing techniques are associated with the East, and similar to Quiren, whose ancestors, like Velka herself, hail from Izalith, they dance with their dual-wielded blades to fight against invaders who seek to vandalize the painting. As Priscilla was a failure, she didn't have anywhere in the world to belong to. Velka entrusted her to manage the painted world from within, to take care of its inhabitants. Priscilla acts akin to Velka. She serves as a mother to those with no place to call home. And Velka is referenced as the mother of the forlorn. She parallels Velka in other ways, such as with her magic that turns her invisible, a reference to Velka's occult ploys and modus operandi. As she wields the Life Hunt Scythe, scythes are also associated with Velka. She performs dance-like techniques. Bleed is mostly relegated to Eastern weapons in Dark Souls, a vague tie to the ancestral origin of Velka as an Eastern witch. Velka felt alienated, like the forlorn she fought and cared for. She was practically exiled from her homeland for the sake of a political marriage, and had to live among people foreign to her. She developed a deep sense of empathy for those who face similar desolation. Gwyndolin, the trickster god, would use his illusory magic alongside a magic ring that changes one's voice to that of the other gender to assume the appearance of other gods and convince a majority to oust Gwyn as the king of the gods. To put himself, the only male offspring of Gwyn who still resided in Anorlondo, and was thus the most fit to be his successor, in his place. A depiction of Gwyndolin inheriting Gwyn's role can be found as an illustration on future miracle scrolls, which tell the tale of the gods of the Way of White. Gwyn would be removed from his position through a political coup, and sentenced to sacrifice himself to fuel Velka's bonfire, a recreation of the First Flame, to alleviate the consequences of his great sin. He would be the first to link the fire, and the title he became known for after his judgment, Lord of Cinder, is a symbolic mockery of his former title, Lord of Light. His punishment was the most damning of all. He would be forced to act as a mindless embodiment of the bonfire itself, destined to fight, die, and be reborn for almost an eternity as a shell of his former self. A punishment that parallels the fate of those afflicted by his curse. The most loyal of his knights would follow his penal walk. They would be charred by the linking of the fire, their armors turning black, like those of the Silver Knights who faced the chaos of Izalith. Their spirits would roam the starway to Gwyn's sepulture. The final battle of the first game is yet another reference to the battles of Stoicism, that were so valued as tests of strength to warriors who aspire to become great. The kiln of the First Flame is a visual reference to the Tower of Babel after it had been smitten by divine retribution. A subtle, allegorical reference to Velka, the god of sin's punishment, as Gwyn is a man who played God, but also looks like a ruined Colosseum, and Gwyn is its champion. By besting him in combat, the Chosen Undead proves his valor one final time. As consequence of this power struggle, the gods of Anorlondo flash the capital alongside the nobles. Gwyndolin engulfs the world of man in a great illusion as to present it as the ever-prosperous city of legend, though the dusk had already befallen it because of the first linking of the fire. The culmination of the golden sorceries he invented during his stay in Oolacile is the false son of Anorlondo, a monumentally stronger version of the cast light spell. He would pose as the gods whose presence was now absent, taking their forms and voices through his illusory magic, coupled with the reversal ring. The nameless blacksmith deity was the only other resident who chose to remain there. The reason for this is that giants are simple-minded beings. The giant blacksmith was oblivious to the conspiracies that unfolded before him, and thus was fooled by Gwyndolin's illusions that populated Anorlondo to preserve the divine image of the city of the gods. He simply never stopped to think about his surroundings and kept obsessively working, for that is all he knew how to do. He was later assumed to have died, for the gods of Anorlondo fled, yet he remains there alone. The multiple sculptures made from demonic titanite that serve as strategically placed sentinels had a legend spread about them. They were rumored to have been born from the remains of the mythical blacksmith deity. Gwyndolin would spread the fabricated prophecy throughout the lands, and quickly, a legion of undead would take pilgrimage to Lordran to attempt to fulfill it. Gwyndolin, Like Velka, acts in the shadows, and unlike her, and like Gwyn, in the light as well, for he embodies both the sun and the moon, both the male and female. He serves as the new leader of Velka's Covenant of the Knights of the Dark Moon, who punish the guilty, and later also protects the journeying undead to ensure that they're able to link the fire. The Book of the Guilty was previously overseen by Velka, and after she had sacrificed herself, Gwyndolin assumes the role of overseer. His hiding place lies beyond an illusion of Gwyn, an emblematic entrance to his father's tomb that represents his deceitful betrayal toward him. However, Gwyndolin still loves his father dearly, despite his great sin, which is why he chose his tomb as his hiding place, to mourn for him. Gwyndolin is a master manipulator who charms and guides undead to work for the Firelink conspiracy. One of his methods of manipulation, as previously explained, involves disguising himself with illusory magic and the voice-altering reversal ring. He poses as Guinevere to the worthy undead who journey to Underlondo to fulfill the prophecy, should they defeat the clone of Ornstein and the executioner Smough. Proving themselves worthy, he bequeaths them the Lord Vessel. It is implied, however, that his illusion of Guinevere stands for Fina, the goddess of love as well, who might be a mere persona of his fabrication. Lautrec, the embraced knight, seems to be following Fina's commands. Fina personifies what he was seeking. He desired love, and so Gwyndolin exploited his wish in order to control him. He was the one who maimed and imprisoned Anastasia, the Firekeeper, to punish her for having spread the Curse of Undead under the Way of Fight's orders. She was made to link her soul to a bonfire, and to tend to it in order to mend her sin against mankind by aiding the undead she produced. She was the first Firekeeper. Lautrec states that he's got pressing matters to attend above, at Underlondo, and context clues tells us that he works for Gwyndolin. He carries souvenirs of reprisal with him, and can be found near Guinevere's chamber. His mission was to punish sinners who contributed to Gwyn's conspiracy of the curse, and it's possible that Anastasia was not the first Firekeeper he murdered, as he is found imprisoned in a cell at the parish of the Way of White, and near him is a Firekeeper soul resting on a corpse. He was caught by followers of the religion and imprisoned for his crime. Of course, the agents of the Firelink conspiracy would never admit the esoteric truth behind their ploy. They intelligently took advantage of Gwyn's propaganda by using Gwyn as the poster boy of the prophecy. He was the first who engaged in self-sacrifice to link the fire. They claimed that by linking the fire, the undead would be helping to prolong the Age of Fire, as was Gwyn's will. Gwyn was viewed as the supreme, divine ruler of man by most. It wouldn't be wise to attempt to convince the masses to turn against him. They would never believe he was the one responsible for the curse that ruins mankind. After all, he even preached against the agents of the dark, and ordered undead hunts to supposedly quell the plague, and he sent one of his knights to fight against the Abyss, and so on. They would never understand that Gwyn was the cause for the Abyss running wild in the first place. Despite being an archetypal antichrist, he was perceived by people as a benevolent god, and the prophecy of firelinking built upon that idea, painting him as a Christ-like figure to inspire the undead. Velka's many subordinates would work in secrecy to craft the path and to assist in the journey of the Chosen Undead. Miniatures of the firelinking bonfire, which are also fueled by remains of the undead, were forged and deployed out throughout the lands. Stone replicas of a great blacksmith of Astora were positioned throughout Lordran. Rings of sacrifice and other types of magical artifacts were spread and sold around, some of which were hidden behind illusory walls, referencing Gwyndolin's magic. Purging stones were developed to prevent loss of self, etc. The player character is an undead that was abducted and confined within an asylum, a place designed as a desperate measure to prolong the Age of Fire.
And in this land, the undead are corralled and led to the north. Where they are locked away to await the end of the world.
Imprisoning undead is a systematic way of efficiently extracting their souls. In solitary confinement, they quickly lose themselves, their sanity, so calling such prison complexes asylums is deeply ironic. 2 stray demons were ordered to guard the asylum to prevent the undead from enacting the prophecy. Should the sun be extinguished, the Chaos Flame, the artificial, parasitic sun of Izalith, that serves as a microcosmic parallel to the Dark Sign, would be as well. If the Chosen Undead proves his worth by defeating the demonic gatekeeper, a gigantic crow, a servant of Velka, transports him to the Firelink shrine, a place whose design is highly symbolic. The shrine is flooded by water, the element opposite of fire. Its focal point is a statue that depicts Velka holding a baby, who is Gwyndolin, the inheritor of her will. In front of Velka's statue is a trapdoor that is connected to the deeper layers of the earth, where the Lord Vessel is placed, and where the primordial serpents reside. Velka's crow is constantly observing the shrine. There is a ring of sacrifice near the hub. The eclipse, which is the culmination of the Firelink conspiracy, has been foreshadowed since the first game. The design of the bonfire itself portrays the draining of the sun. The pommel of the coiled sword represents the drained, empty sun of the eclipse. Its handle and blade represents the fire being drained to the underworld, and its guard represents the earth, the rolled surface, with the 4 points being symbolic of the 4 cardinal directions. The bones of undead that fuel the fire are also symbolic of the martyrdom of those who follow the prophecy, though the fire is ultimately directed at them, conversely symbolizing the true aim of the conspiracy, which is to empower man by undoing the curse. The Chosen Undead must prove his worth, that is, must build up his soul, by ringing 2 bells, one of them being located above, atop the undead parish, and the other below, past Blighttown, an obvious reference to the esoteric law of as above, so below. The now named Bells of Awakening, a reference to the awakening brought by the prophecy to the world, were, in times past, used to signal the coming of envoys or merchants to the managers of their respective territories. Now, they are used to signal to the slave giants of Sen's Fortress, who operate under Sif's orders, and Sif is an agent of the conspiracy, to open the gates, so that the Chosen Undead can prove himself worthy of reaching an Orlando by conquering the 1000 Traps and the Iron Golem. Ironically, the false objective of the fortress from its inception, which was to test those who aspired to become Silver Knights, relates to its current function. It's also worth mentioning that upon ringing the first Bell of Awakening, an agent of Velka appears before the Chosen Undead to sell him goods and offer him a pardon for his misdeeds, yet another subtle hint that ties Velka to the prophecy. As previously explained, the demons of Izalith were ordered to serve as literal gatekeepers to prevent the Chosen Undead from linking the fire. The Capra demon has stolen the key to the depths, the reformed commerce route that connects the external worlds to Izalith. He has charmed the dogs through the use of the Undead Report, a pyromancy that charms creatures that thirst for souls, as its name implies. His eyes are of a reddish pink color, implying a connection to that spell. The depths are, or rather, they became, after extensive reforms, a vast sewer complex that connects all of Lordran. The curse was particularly harmful to residential areas, as piles of burning corpses of undead were deliberately placed near houses so that contaminated sparks would be inhaled by the commoners. The desperate plebeians dealt with the curse by forging iron bars to quarantine certain areas, where undead were more prominent, but that proved fruitless. They had to resort to banishing the sick to the depths, which became an improvised prison for greedy undead, the adjective denoting, in this case, cannibalistic tendencies or killing intent by those close to hollowing. So, the depths became a melting pot of zombies and slimy cannibals. The greediest among them would develop a cannibalistic compulsion, so uncontrollable they'd bloat like pigs. Blighttown used to be a liminal space that connected Izalith to the world of the surface. As it was blocked off from the outside world, and the depths were turned into a massive sewer complex, all the impurities of Lordran, including its undesirables, would fall into its water, turning it foul. The blood of man is particularly toxic, and a great deal of corpses were among the waste that was disposed into the depths. The undead who fell into the swamp were in such desperation that they fed off the impure, poisonous water, which contained an abundance of organic remains of the deceased. The binge eating that resulted from their starvation softens them into blobs of pus. This condition is what became known as the Great Blightpus. It's interesting to note that the Blightpus afflicted undead drop green titanite, which is implied to be the petrified, soul-imbued remains of men who died at the swamp, just like the enormous green leeches that can be seen feeding on corpses, and organic residues at the corners of Blighttown. Upon seeing the sad state of the decrepit men, who had become deformed sludges of inflamed flesh due to the misery that was imposed onto them by the curse, a demonic woman from Izalith devoted herself to caring for them. She'd swallowed the great Blightpus, healing all the meek undead who ended up in Blighttown. This act of martyrdom earned her a saintly reputation, and she'd be referred to as the Fair Lady from then on. Her selfless deed crippled her, however, and she has to become a firekeeper. That is, she has to link her very soul to a bonfire, which would nurture it through the humanity of its core, though not even that extreme measure proved enough to sustain her, which is why Kirk, the Knight of Thorns, became an invader, to steal humanities of journeying undead and gift them to her. His actions can be mirrored by the Chosen Undead through the covenants that is offered by the Fair Lady. The men she healed would dedicate their lives to protecting the entrance to her lair. They'd build a slum, which would be appropriately named Blighttown, on the walls and pillars that sustains the sewer complex, and organize themselves under guerrilla formations to tactically dispose of invaders, some of whom seek to loot the treasures of the lost civilization of Izalith, like the fabled Chaos Blade. The bodies of multiple such invaders, including some of undead, who travels there to fulfill the prophecy, can be found lying on wooden platforms. Some of the men would volunteer to become hosts to parasites, turning into egg servants as a show of gratitude to their savior. The once slimes had their bodies restored, and the excess humanity, pus, and residue was fertilized and became egg-like appendages. Despite their tortured appearance, they probably suffered more when they were cannibalistic blobs of melted flesh and bone. The reason why we only find Blightpus afflicted undead in the depths and not in Blighttown is that the slimes that climbed back to the depths did not get to meet the Fair Lady, and thus were never cured. When first entering the Gaping Dragon's arena, the cutscene that plays shows us that it is climbing the sewers, similarly to the Blightpus slimes. The Gaping Dragon's body looks nothing like a proper Archdragon's. As the Dragon King Great Axe's item description states, it's deformed. The forewings are still there, but the rest of its form is a hideous mess, topping it off with a giant gaping mouth which opens from its underbody, and reveals itself to be filled with sharp teeth-like bones. Its design is referenced by creatures of later entries, for reasons I will disclose in later videos. During its encounter, the Gaping Dragon can vomit a pool of Blightpus. It is suffering from food poisoning. This final section will cover the relevant NPCs of Dark Souls 1, whose story has not been addressed up to this point. Laurentius travels from the past to the present to reach Lordran. The Great Swamp is in the past, and Lordran is in the present. As previously explained, the Great Swamp is Izalith and its surroundings, such as Blighttown, from the past. Pyromancy became a taboo after Gwyn declared war on Izalith. The Great Swamp was altered due to the birth of the Bat of Chaos. All that lava did not arise out of nowhere. It is swamp water that got corrupted by the chaos of the ritual. That's also why there are so many animated dragon legs in Izalith. The swamp was full of remains of dragons, which were reanimated by the chaotic flame. We don't know when Laurentius was captured, and for how long he was imprisoned. Considering he was the only undead we find alive in those barrels, which were once used to store meat and other goods, but are now containers of corpses and abducted undead, and as there are cannibal butchers inhabiting the sewers, one of whom guards the meat storage where Laurentius is kept, it's safe to conclude that he was abducted during his journey up the depths. Laurentius comes from the past, as in, he traveled through time, much like we the player. He tells us that, in this land, pyromancers earn a certain respect. The Witch of Izalith, one of the legendary lords, is the godmother of pyromancy. But that is contradicted by what the game tells us in other instances, as pyromancy is referred to as being heretical, and the Great Swamp being a place of heretics. Heresy mostly being a propagandistic term to describe that which stands in opposition to Gwyn, which implies that Laurentius precedes the war against the demons, the events that ruined the superficially amicable relation between Gwyn and the witches, and that made pyromancy a taboo. The Great Swamp being described as a place full of nature is most definitely related to the fact that it was essentially a cemetery of remains of dragons, arch-trees, and men who fought in the war against the dragons. Nature thrives there due to the abundance of organic remains. Poisonous pyromancy being considered particularly heretical is because they employ vaporized blood of man, which is implied to possess poisonous qualities, and to be what makes the water of Blighttown so poisonous. There are other connections between the Great Swamp and Izalith, such as Cuculus and Cornyx from Dark Souls 3. I'll repeat that the depths used to be a trade route that connected Izalith to the outside world. That is why Domhnall of Zena can be seen sitting there, like an ordinary merchant would have done in ancient times. Laurentius meets his end at Blighttown. Ironically, he couldn't locate himself around his own birthplace, as it had changed so drastically, and as he became physically lost, he lost his sense of belonging and his sense of self too, which made him go hollow. Big Hat Logan was a prodigal sorcerer who held a high rank among the students of Vinheim. He deliberately turns undead, a bannable offense in Vinheim, one that leads to exile, and journey through the lands. Logan was an ascetic type, and so he cared little for how others judged him. His iconic big hat, which completely hid his face, and he used to block the noise and stares from others around him to more sharply focus on his thoughts, is emblematic of his introverted and introspective character. It can be said that he was the most genuine of scholars, and the Soul Spear, a spell which he invented, was said to rival Gwyn's lightning. His catalyst, which used to be an ordinary one, was nurtured from his soul, and from the advanced spells he conjured through it. Catalysts are conductive artifacts, after all. The reason for him choosing to become undead was to further his own studies. He desires the immortality of the dragons, and he was keen to notice the connection between it and death itself. Indeed, their fabled immortality was merely a result of their state as unalive statues of stone. He would eventually desire to return to Vinheim, and for that he allowed himself to be captured by one of Sif's traps in the hopes of being transported to his archives in a clandestine way. The Vinheim he returned to was abandoned, for the world of man had been abandoned. As he deepened his knowledge, he gradually lost his sanity, a reference to the Lovecraftian ideas of eldritch enlightenment. He ultimately stripped himself naked, leaving only his big hat on his head, the logical conclusion of his now extreme asceticism. Griggs becomes a devoted follower due to his admiration for his collected and ambitious character. But most importantly, he felt a personal connection to Logan because he himself had become undead and was expelled from the academy. We find him trapped in a barrel, inside a locked house in the lower undead burg. He was captured by followers of the Way of White during one of their undead hunts, though his capturers themselves hollowed, for the undead hunts fulfills their purpose of spreading the plague. The royals of Vinheim devised a method of excluding undesirables. They would enroll those they considered unwelcome, such as nobles of lower standing, but they'd be made to serve as thieves and assassins, and they would only be allowed to learn basic sorceries and spells designed for the purpose of assassination. As soon as the foolish assassins of Vinheim made a hit, they'd become undead, and as consequence would be expelled from the academy. Griggs was one such fool, as his black sorcerer sat denotes. Petrus, whose name means stone, which in this context is an allegory for apostle, serves as a stand-in for Turland's nobles. He lacks faith in the Way of White, for he recognizes it as a sham, yet is a high-ranking cleric. His real purpose is to spread death. We find cracked red-eye orbs hidden near his location, alongside the remains of clerics, implying he's an invader and a murderer. He's arrogant and does not wish to be near undead, for his home is at the world of men, though he himself was essentially exiled from it. As I've explained, those who kill undead absorb their accursed souls and turn undead themselves. Petrus was sent in a mission that would inevitably contaminate him. He would never be allowed to return to his homeland. King Jeremiah used to be the husband of the Witch of Chaos. He assumed a distorted, demonic shape as the Chaos Flame touched him, which is why his head is covered in blood-soaked bandages. It's interesting to note that the wall-hugging demon of Blighttown, who bears an appearance eerily similar to him, is internally named Prince Izalith. He was exiled, however, and ended up as one of the forlorn inhabitants of the Painted World. His attire is peculiarly similar to the armor of Lautrec, the Embraced Knight, and if we trade his headpiece with Snuggly, he pays with a ring of favor and protection, further connecting the two characters. This implies that he betrayed Izalith for Fina, Gwyndolin's illusion, and works under him. This is why he invades us as the Painted World. He was instructed to protect Priscilla, the forsaken sister of Gwyndolin, from trespassers. The Dark Moon Knightess was a woman from Karim, as implied by her possessing a parrying dagger, who became afflicted with the curse. Gwyndolin called upon her, recognizing her usefulness despite her abhorrent condition. He gifted her with an ornate armor set so that she could hide her ghastly appearance, and ordained her one of his knights. She was instructed to become a firekeeper to aid the undead who reach Anor Londo, as well as to hunt the guilty. The Covenant of the Forest Hunters was founded as a means of hiring warriors to protect Artorias' grave. However, there are many who join its ranks for opportunistic reasons, to have a justification to hunt men for their goods and be rewarded for it. Shiva is one of those types. Havel fought side to side with Gwyn. He was a member of his clan during the Dragon War of the Age of Ancients. He was a principled man. Even though Sif's betrayal was key to their victory, he deeply despised him for his dishonor. And like Faram, who opposed his father, the excesses of men that led to the extinction of the magnificent beings once admired and respected as worthy opponents by Gwyn's own clan caused him to rebel. Havel and his followers would conspire against the gods and stand for Dragonkin, which ironically meant they would begrudgingly collaborate with Sif, for Sif hosted one of the only living descendants of the ancient dragons within his secluded garden, the Ash Lake, an isolated, chamber-like realm that features the ruined past, with its soil being the ash that derives from the firestorm of the witches, and its inhabitants being the creatures that were born out of the remains of dead dragons. A scroll of one of Havel's, whose title within the world of men used to be that of Bishop, followers, can be found in Ash Lake, implying one of the Havel warriors stood there as a guardian. And the armor of one of his followers can be found behind an illusory wall, implying a connection to Gwyndolin and the Firelink conspiracy, alongside an occult weapon designed to slay the gods. Solaire is symbolic of the average undead who embarks on pilgrimage to fulfill the prophecy. A foolish, but well-intentioned adventurer who is completely oblivious of the conspiracies that hide in the shadows, not unlike the player himself. This is why his arc is one of disillusionment. It subtextually symbolizes the betrayal faced by the undead who thought they were inheriting the will of Gwyn, the divine ruler, the Lord of Light, who thought they were emboldening the Sun, the magnificent Father, but who are, in fact, ruining it. In the description of this video and on the pinned comments, there will be a comprehensive reading list of books that I strongly believe have served as sources of inspiration for Miyazaki's works, or that, at the very least, bear striking similarities to them. And this is the end of part 1. This series will be composed of 3 parts, one for each game of the trilogy. After it is finished, I'll bundle the 3 chapters into one grand video that will feature additional content. I sincerely thank you for watching. My aim with this series is to uncover every secret and take note of every detail of Dark Souls, to decipher the series to perfection, to the best of my ability. I hope you have enjoyed this video.